So today our focus would be on the communication. But to start with that, what I would like to go through with you is some key concept of Chinese culture. Then we can talk about more detail, and particularly I will illustrate to you how the communication can be more effective in the practical situations. So as some of you are different in the different areas of collaboration with China. Some of you are trading with China, export, import. Others are doing technology transfer. Some of you are looking for investment or acquisition from China or into China. And I understand some of you also in education and cultural exchanges. What are the things in common for all these kind of collaborations is that you would have some basic elements right. And this is what at Crayfish we developed this, we call Crayfish 4C model, where we look at all the important factors that help you to be cross-culturally successful. And the context is important in that today we're talking about different cultures, the way to communicate, they're different. And it make it worse sometimes because of time differences, although it could be also advantages. And of course, in China, the laws and regulations are very different. The ways of doing business different. So you need to appreciate that context. And then it's important to have the content right. Here, when we say content, we meant you have to have the accurate information to be shared in order for both sides to have a shared vision and also to share, the strategy and how it's implemented. Of course, it's important always to have the right communication. That's why today we dedicated a session about communication. And in terms of communication, it's important to have the internal process to make sure all internal, whether staff or or board of directors, but in joint venture, both sides needs to communicate very well. And then generally, there's of course the public and stakeholders. What is the most also, the important, not least, last but not least, you have the connector we called, which is really people, whether these are people who advise you, facilitates your deals with China, or these are the people to actually make things happen. You may need a different organization structure when it comes to your China entity because of the culture as well. So in a nutshell, you need to look at all these elements. And what we are trying to do in Crayfish is in different series, we are addressing some of the issues in turn. So today we are going to focus on communication. To start with, in China, most of you understand what is, or have heard at least, Guanxi. Essentially, these two characters has its own meanings, and it literally means the gate to connect. It's a gateway, or it's a way to connect and link. Some people translate Guanxi into relationship, but it's more than that. Yet I always get asked by people to say, yeah, I understand, Guanxi works in China, but it's old days when China was just opening up, when there's a lot of state-owned business, but now is it still important? Is it still relevant? My answer is always yes. And of course, the level of importance depends on, for example, whether you are dealing with Chinese government or you're dealing with large enterprises. And these are quite different. And of course, it also depends on the sectors. For example, education sector, it's very much depending on Guanxi, with not just the central Ministry of Education think tanks, but also at local level, the local education authority. This is because K-12 education is heavily regulated in terms of supplies to schools. And due to the tradition of Chinese respect for hierarchy and the legacy of a centralized economy, the relationship between government and business enterprises has always been very close. That's also why the political and civil links continue to be very useful for companies wishing to be successful in doing business in China. And sometimes business in China are actually organized around Guanxi. For example, the education sector I mentioned, it is not easy to find many national providers, although there are some in online education and tutoring, etc. But in other cases, for example, supplies to schools, you will find that many of the businesses are very much focused on one province or one city. This is because the Guanxi they have in that particular place is very strong, and it's impossible sometimes for them to replicate outside the comfortable zone. What I want to talk about also is that you can develop Guanxi as a British person, because sometimes people ask me, yes, I'm not born in China, I didn't go to university, I didn't have schoolmates there. How do I build that relationship? So here's the example. This is one of our clients, Simon. In the picture, you can see it's his first trip to go to China. And if you have read, by the way, recently Crayfish's blog, Simon actually wrote a guest blog about his first trip to China, where he has experienced firsthand the cultural learning in a very interesting way, I would say. I strongly recommend that you go to our website, to the blog section to read. It promises interesting reading. So when he went to China, he was determined to build his relationship with Guanxi. So he took his book, he authored a book about leadership and gave it to one of the top think tank leaders, Professor Guanxi, in a top picture, and that immediately sort of broke the meeting in a very friendly way of discussion around the academic, aspect, soft skill of Chinese people. And then on the way we walk out of the meeting room, we saw the second most senior man in the institution, which is the government think tank for education ministry. It's called National Institute of Education Science. And Mr. Zheng was playing ping pong. So Simon decided to put down his suit and bag to play a minute of ping pong. That is amazing, because that immediately built that personal relationship with Mr. Zheng, who has not until then be aware of Simon's visit. So that just gives example of making the effort to build that connection, build a relationship. So the second time, this is the first trip. The second time Simon went to China on his own recently, and he managed to meet both of them and move forward the business discussion to a very structured entry to China. So now there's another concept which you again have heard, most of you probably. It's called Mianzi. Essentially, just means face, and this is very much embedded in the Chinese culture. And I just want to give you some examples of what exactly it means, and then you can think about in your personal experience where you have realized maybe it's because of that. So Chinese people very much pay attention to the face, and the face essentially means it's how other people sees you and how you see yourself in the other people's eyes. And so Chinese people would like to earn face, so they have to look good for others, for their friends, for the other people. They have to look good. So that's why you can see all the young ladies save a whole year probably salary to buy a LV bag. That's the same with men, probably, saving a lot of money, buy a nice watch. And then sometimes the face, by spending money, you can buy face. This is what the Chinese would say. And you probably don't know what the word says in that picture, but it's basically the guy on the left says, I have more money than you, I will pay for the bill. And so the poor cashier person sitting there seeing these two people fight. And this is actually not a rare thing. It's a very common thing in any Chinese restaurant if you have been to enough. And basically, whoever buys the bill will get the respect from others to show you do better, and particularly when it comes to friendly situation where reunion of friends, and this is very common. But of course, I'm not suggesting that you have to fight to pay your bill. And when you go to China, typically as a guest, the host would treat you. And then this is very common, even in the West, you would say, saving face, don't wash sort of dirty linen in public. But in China, this is much more important. Of course, it's two-edged sword. In the domestic scene, a lot of the Chinese, sort of domestic violence will get hidden because of that culture. Now the government changed that. But on the business side, there's also companies, for example, including politically, when there's a corruption involved, people don't want the public to know because it's seen as bad news. However, that is changing. Recently, we've seen some internet companies, even including the big like JD.com, they're actually self-disclosing some corruptive practices in the supply chain and to clean up. So that, but in general, the culture is that you would not want to do that. And of course, this is the most important, the giving face. And that is something I really want you to remember for this slide, is you have to show respect to people at the right time. Even Trump, when, the trade, with all these trade wars and, tit for tat. However, when President Xi announced he's going to stay as president forever, and Trump was asked for that, I believe, at a conference, and he actually hailed it. He said, "This is great. This is actually, I may consider that too." So, what I was trying to say is that even you have differences at the right time, you have to show respect. For that, I'm sure he was giving a very nice brownie mark for that. So now we would like to come to the core element of today, as communication. So with bearing all that in mind, the relationship building, etc. The difference we haven't witnessed is that maybe if you are a Western person, you would probably experience this yourself. We would in the West rely on emails for important daily actually communication, long emails documenting what we like to do, structured conversation in emails. Or now, of course, we start using software like Trello, etc. However, this is not what the Chinese side are used to, and or are becoming more used to. So in China, everyone uses WeChat. If you have not had WeChat, you must do that, because that's a way now for really the most useful, powerful way to communicate with your Chinese counterpart. But even WeChat is not as good as if you can actually jump on the plane and go to visit your contacts in China. So if you are seriously thinking to China is important to you, you have to commit that, at least a few trips to China to meet in face-to-face. And that is really the most effective way. And of course, to make the communication informal and make it personal, and that is also important to build a relationship. And WeChat is perfect for that. And what is also good is even top people in China can be very personal, because they would get the PA or secretary to open an email or an open letter, but they would not give the WeChat to their secretary normally, because it also contains personal messages. And therefore, if you have your key Chinese contacts WeChat, you can get to that decision maker very personal level, which is very important. So here I would like to just go a little bit more specific about communication in terms of how exactly you make use, for example, of WeChat. What I've showed you, this is actually a live group chat we run for one of our clients in China. So this group has got 6 people, including a senior level, including implementation level. I'm also in it. So on a daily basis, we would have this chat and send in documents, agree on meetings, and everything needs to be very short, but it's constant every day. And they, in the morning, evening, because the Chinese are actually time zone, it actually works that you could get things overnight, things done. And also, it's important to have that multi-level communication. By multi-level, I meant if you're dealing with a Chinese big organization, you got to make sure you have the relation with the top guy and with also the middle level, but even lower level. Again, I give you a real example of Simon. You remember the previous slides where he played ping pong with the very top guy, and he gave the book and discussion with the leading think tank professor in China. And here, he's also engaging the sort of executive level of Mr. Wang, who's actually director of a scheme that actually helped with the business. And so that is important. And it's also engaging even the primary school kids. And of course, that's also important when he visits a school to try to convince them of this leading solution he's trying to promote in China. So that sort of level shows you if you engage all stakeholders at a different level, then you really get your message across. So little tips, if you do ask many times your counterparts in China, are you happy to sign these terms? Are you happy with this, or do you want to buy this particular product? And if you never hear back, just assuming that it's a no. Because we talked about face early on, the Chinese way is not to upset you by saying no, because that's making you feel bad and making them also lose face, because they seem to be upsetting friends. So if they have a good relationship with you, they would not want to upset you. So then you understand. But of course, sometimes you can clarify that to say, is this off, or I assume you're not interested, so you can get a definite answer. I mentioned early on the time differences, but because the UK is the creator of the time zone, is actually very good in terms of communication. We found our local team, we constantly communicate with them, but typically for important, we need them to do during their time. Chinese time, we would send the messages before our time, sort of late night, so that it gets done. So do make use of that communication. It can save you each time a day for the communication. And just to say also, it's really important if you do use WeChat, you have to make sure, well, this is not just WeChat. In general, you have to be careful sharing confidential information. But really, on WeChat, it's very easy to share, and sometimes by accident, the confidential information could be shared in groups when it was not meant to. So make sure if it's really important information, you can still go back to email. I'm not saying that you should only use WeChat, but the fact is also, remember we talk about succinct. Because people send so many WeChat messages, you need to keep your core message very brief, just brief, but then additional information can be sent by email. So I hope this is helpful. This is very much sort of on the communication technique, but because some of you may not speak the Chinese language, and that is becomes a problem if you have to make your messages cross very clearly. So you have to make sure your translation is done properly, otherwise you end up lost in translation, which we do not want, right? So in China, you may be aware that, for example, Hong Kong is a different different region when it comes to the language. It speaks Cantonese, but also the translation is different. For example, Michael Jackson in Hong Kong, it's Michael Jackson, but in mainland, it's Michael or Jack Shin. So there are different characters. So that's just an example to show you need to watch the regions to notice that difference. And of course, also the different characters. If you can see the symbol in the middle, the one on the left, that is a traditional character, and to the right is the simplified, which is used mainland. The traditional ones only used in Taiwan and Hong Kong, Macau. And the real recent example is one of the clients have the translation done by a Taiwanese translator. And the Taiwanese translator, without thinking, just used traditional characters. But then when the document was sent to mainland, the mainland distributor say, we want simplified characters, and that has to be redone. So that is important always to check where your region is going to be used. And if you are going to have an interpreter in China, make sure you brief them, not just send them the slides, actually talk them through in person or remotely. And again, this is to show you that Simon, before when he was in China, he engaged the the younger team who are actually providing the translation interpretation for him to the sort of senior team, and he actually talked them through, explaining to them what's behind those bullet points, so that when it was later at the meeting, the girl did a really good job in interpreting. So on that, I think we finished the core part of the presentation. I just then wanted to quickly run through to how Crayfish can help you before we open up to questions. So Crayfish has two ways we help clients do business in China. We have an innovative marketplace. It's the first in the world that dedicated to Chinese speaking expertise, where you can post your project, whether it's open a WeChat account, or is it a translation, or is it to find a distributor. You can find those freelancing individuals who can help on the project basis for you, and you do need to pay them, but online, only after the project is done. Only when you are happy, you can release the fund through our platform. So it's all simple and secure, and we have many clients who have used that. On the other side of the slides, you see a Crayfish Enterprise is where we would help handhold the clients when they are more large and complicated projects, where you have more than one service required. For example, you may want your trademark translated, then trademark filed in China. You may want it to have some market research combined with finding a partner. You may want to recruit a Chinese engineer in China, but in the meantime, you also wanted to have some advice on the HR practice in China. So we have a relationship manager who can work with you and help take that the process through with you, bring those resources, whether these are our freelancing individuals or our partners who are boutique agencies in China, etc. We bring those resources and make them work for you in a seamless way. And then whether this can be strategy or planning or different aspects of operation, what we are trying to help is to group all this together, as I mentioned. Particularly on this communication side, if you do need help with the language side, we offer various options to help, starting from very cost effective way to do things through machine translation plus slide review, to the sort of to the very premium service where we have project managers who look after you. So that So on that note, the formal presentation are finished. So now we're opening to questions. And if you have questions, I believe you can send it through. There's a question panel on your right hand of the control panel, and then you can type it there and then send it through. We then are able to address them for you.
Okay, the first question comes through. It's about gift etiquette in China, and what's your top tips when we give gifts to our Chinese counterparts?
Good question. We actually will in the future have a particular etiquette on visits to China, how to make your visit to China productive. But a short answer is you should always take some gifts with you in your trip. And if it's your first trip and you don't know people in person, you just take some standard gifts, small gifts like, if something represents your country, for example, whether there's teacups, well, teacups are breakable, whether there's teaspoons, for example, or whether these are bookmarks, whatever. So you can actually distribute them to the people you see as a little gesture. But then the second time or future times, if you know these people already and you know what they like, then you can take some personal gifts to some of them. For example, in our previous example, Simon, in his second trip, he then took one of the guy in the slides, a Chinese guy, he really liked whiskey. So Simon took a pack of 10 little whiskey tasters, and that went really well with Mr. Wang. And for the ladies who helped him with interpretation last time, he then took some little rose scented candles from his region, things like that. So again, it shows that the intention, but also the effort you make, that goes a long way to build a relationship with your contacts. And so in one of the future webinars, we will be talking a bit more about etiquette, etc.
Okay, we're waiting for more questions coming through. The second question. So when I went to business trip in China, some event organizers will provide interpreters. Do I need to hire my own interpreters, or should I just use theirs?
That's again a very, very good question. I would always suggest you to hire your own interpreter. This is because you then have the time to actually brief them, particularly if you are selling technology that's not that easy for everyone to grasp in 1 minute. And the disadvantage of relying on the other side's interpreter is, first, they're not briefed, and so they could just struggle with particular terms. Second, they represent the other side's interest, so they may not actually translate everything you say. And remember, we talk about the face, and even interpreter doesn't want to lose face by asking you to say, what do you mean, what is this, or say, I don't understand. So he or she would just skip that, and your message will be lost in translation.
Okay. Another question, how do we engage with WeChat if you don't speak Chinese? Is there a translation service on WeChat?
The question is, yes, there is a translation on WeChat. So when you click a message, right click, there should be one says translate. But also now, a lot of Chinese people speak some kind of English. So if you can always try with English. If they understand, if they don't, then you use the translate. But the problem with those automatic translations, they are powered by machine translation engines. So sometimes they may not always accurate. So you may end up a laugh from the other side or question mark.
Okay. One more question. If there are no more questions coming through, it will be the last one. Is communicating with different generations of Chinese different? So when we communicate, I guess what he meant is that when we communicate with, let's say, millennial Chinese people, or when we communicate with more senior people, are there any communication difference, or are there any tips that we should mind of?
Definitely. Again, that's a really good question. The style is really different. If you are talking to senior people, you use a more formal style. To start with, you address them with, for example, if they're director, you address them as Director Wang, even on WeChat, and you don't address them to the first name. But even younger people, you can really just be very casual with that. That's one. The second is you may have noticed a lot of use of the emoji, and the younger people would really use emojis to express their feelings. And sometimes even you met them first time, they may send you like heart shape, and don't be sort of shocked. And it doesn't mean anything, but it's just a way to express. I just realized the previous question about the WeChat actually had a supplement to say means for speak, not type. So your question means if you speak on WeChat, is that right? And not to type. There are little mini programs on WeChat that enable you to actually speak into it, and they transfer into Chinese. There is that. So if you write to us later, we can see your name here anyway. We will send you that mini program you can install on your WeChat.
Okay, last question. What do you think Brexit means for China and UK business future?
That is really the big question. Well, I think Brexit would, in my view, it would means UK needs more China. UK will need China more than the other way around. Brexit has actually changed that balance of power, I think, between China and UK. I mean, China is already increasingly powerful in the world, but because of Brexit, I think UK is, in my view, is weaker when it comes to the bilateral relationship. So, as you can see, the recent incidents happening this week about high-level visits to China, etc. That does mean UK needs to put a lot more effort and emphasis to work out China's engagement strategy, not just politically, but of course, trade and investment wise. China is already very important in the UK and increasing so. For SMEs, this means that it's even more important that you look at China as a really important market. One, probably as important as in US to plan your future, because Europe is going to be many small markets from after Brexit. But China is a large market, the same size as Europe and bigger probably, but with one market entry, one tariff, and one custom to get in. So China is much more important, I believe, when Brexit actually happens. And I hope the UK government, of course, will be able to strike a good bilateral deal. And of course, you always have Hong Kong, which has a legacy of the UK-China sort of relationship, and that always helped to get into China if their other channels are not open. As open as the UK would like to start with. However, as Brexit hasn't happened yet, this is all our sort of guess. Right. So on that note, I think we'll finish today's.
So thanks very much for attending.
For future.
And for the future, we are hosting more and more webinars on crayfish.io. So if you can visit crayfish.io today, we do have a webinar and events page. Just sign in from there, and we wish to see you next time.
We have in March, we have 3 webinars on IP, on digital marketing, and on selling to China. So do tune in, and we hope to see you there. Thank you. Goodbye. Bye.